folks, welcome back to Recently Seen Reading. I'm Heather, and I've had a pretty good reading week. This week I've plowed through about 7 books, and for a literature review I'm doing maybe 18 to 20 articles read and noted, which is really good progress for me. So I finally finished Quicksilver by Neal Stephenson. Pretty ambivalent feelings and thoughts about Quicksilver at this stage. I mean, it is a postmodern Baroque picaresque novel, essentially. It's a historical novel with some very 20th century language in it, and that's part of the novel that I actually enjoyed the most. That kind of language pops up mostly in the dialogue. The stuff I struggled with the most was how, for a historical novel, there's not actually very much focus on plot. Lots and lots of characters, lots of attention to historical detail, to background physicality of the world, and I simply got weary of it. Not surprising in a book that's more than 900 pages. I think if you like Smollett, one of my favorite 18th century novelists, you might like Quicksilver. So, in part to clear my palate from Stevenson, I then turned to Joan Silber, who I'd never read before, a short novel called Improvement, which is a series of almost short stories, but it's a novel. Perspective changes in every part to a different person who is connected to the primary character in some way. I thought this one was well done and has made me curious to read more Silber in the future. I've never read her work before. What else did I read this month, or this week actually? I read another thriller, Sheena Kamel, Lost Ones, which is a pretty middle-of-the-road thriller. The thing that might make it interesting to folks is that it's set in BC. It uses Indigenous issues in Canada, the kind of dislocation of Indigenous people following the 60s scoop, as part of its plot driver. In terms of how the thriller or the mystery unfolds, Kamel is using a very kind of Sarah Poretsky-like structure. It's a perfectly competent thriller, but nothing outstanding about it. And it's a little uneasy making in the way that Kamel uses a first-person narration to represent an Indigenous perspective. It's a little uneven that way. Then I read, probably the best thing I read in the last week was Helen Dunmore's Spell of Winter. This is something I think I'll return to and reread in the future. The perspective is, and the point of view is from one single character, and there are clear distortions and limitations going on. This kid, the primary character, traces her own history from 5 or 6 till she's probably in her mid-30s, and the parallel fates between her fate and her brother's fate as they live through the disappearance of their mother, their death of their father, other dramatic things happening, the absconding of the brother, essentially, the death of the grandfather, and the intervention of the First World War. And the First World War is, I think, actually what propels the primary narrator into maturity and new insight. It's an interesting kind of novel, and I think it's kind of like the perspective and textual richness that you might find in Sarah Waters. So it's something I think I will reread. It's also a little bit similar to some of A.S. Byatt's writing about the same period in history. So that one was fabulous, I think. Then I read Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles. Now, I read Circe last year, and I thought I'd pick up Song of Achilles just to have both perspectives, and I thought this was actually kind of a meh novel, and I think in retrospect, Pat Barker's Silence of the Girls is actually a stronger novel. It's a quick read. It's been all over YouTube the last couple of years, but not my favorite thing to read. And then winding out the week, I finished Adrienne Rich's Art of the Possible. This is a 2001 collection of her essays, and this has surprised me because the essays range from essays written in the 1970s, the mid-1970s, to the late 90s, and they hold up surprisingly well, and that surprised me. Adrienne Rich is, or was, an American poet, and her thinking was at the core of a lot of feminist thinking and discussion around women's literature in the 70s and in the 80s in particular, and I found it quite fresh. The thing that interests me in it, though, is I recently reread Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider, which covers roughly the same time period in terms of essays, and that Rich's writing seems somehow to be less personal than Lorde's, which is interesting, and I'm not sure how to get at that, but the Adrienne Rich was worth having a read of. I did manage to get to the library and pick up a stack of books. I've got Lost Children's Archive, I've got Historical Mystery, Iona Wishaw's Killer in King's Cove, which I'm hoping it will be better than Jacqueline Winspear's most recent stuff, which I found disappointing. I've got a Gail Jones Corregidor, a little Icelandic novel to get through, something called Snare, and the Line Made by Walking, Sarah Baum's book that was up over YouTube last year. So I think I'll probably be able to get through most of those next week unless I turn my attention to making some headway in Magic Mountain, which is on my reading list for the summer. The reading week as a whole, I think, has been pretty good for me in terms of what I would recommend to someone who likes richly written prose would be Helen Dunmore's Spell of Winter. The rest of them are all kind of middling and interesting, and I don't regret reading them, but I am very glad to have finished Quicksilver. I hope you've had a good week and you have a good reading week